It's the mid-1950s in post-war Britain, where a young RAF bandsman, unsure about his future, is about to make a seemingly trivial decision which he doesn't know will change his life forever. Young Brian, who was rejected as a wannabe fighter pilot, had decided that he wanted to become a corporal. But to do so, he needed to learn another musical instrument alongside his main instrument, which was the trusty tuba. Brian pondered and eventually decided to learn the double bass. Little did he know at the time that this seemingly small decision would transform Brian into one of the most prolific, successful and influential bass players of all time, under his stage name of Herbie Flowers. Performing on over a whopping 20,000 songs in his lifetime, an estimated 500 of which were chart-topping hits, you'd expect Herbie Flowers to be a name that was known the world over. With a diverse CV including Bowie, McCartney, Elton John, Cat Stevens, Camel, Eartha Kitt and the Moody Blues, one would imagine Herbie's playing to be celebrated along with the likes of other session heavyweights from the golden age of pop music, such as Carol Kaye, James Jamerson and Tony Levin. And yet, his name is missing from almost all lists of the greatest bass players of all time, including lists from Rolling Stone magazine, Guitar World and Consequence of Sound. Now normally I'm usually not that affected by celebrity deaths. Of course, anyone's passing is a great tragedy for all those people who knew and loved that person or simply enjoyed their work. But when I learned that prog granddad Herbie Flowers had passed away on September the 6th earlier this year, I was deeply moved by his loss. And the fact that someone so influential and important to my life as an artist was gone really hit me. I was also frankly greatly disappointed at how badly wrong so many news outlets got Herbie Flowers' life. He wasn't just the walk on the wild side and the T-Rex guy, he was an innovator, an eccentric and a true artist. Because of the lack of any form of documentary or feature about his life being made on mainstream television, I've decided to take matters into my own hands and create Walking on the Wild Side, the life of Herbie Flowers. If you're new to Herbie's work and you only know the hits, or if you're a seasoned Herbie Flowers professional, I really hope you enjoy this video and learn something new. Brian Keith Flowers was born on May the 19th, 1938, to parents Elsie and John Flowers in Isleworth, Middlesex. Like many children of his generation, Herbie Flowers' childhood was indelibly shaped by the Second World War. His first big encounter with music came when he was attending Holy Trinity Primary School, where his music teacher Mrs. Barlow told him, "You've got perfect pitch, you should do music." Her advice unfortunately fell on deaf ears until young Brian was studying at Tiffin Boys' School, a place he later described as a posh dump. Aside from receiving the slipper from prefects, Brian could not stand cross-country and rugby, so took to hiding in the school's band room until he was caught by school bandmaster George Spriggs, who asked what he was doing. Brian, ever the quick thinker, told a white lie and said he had asthma and therefore couldn't do cross-country or rugby. George then offered him an ultimatum, saying, "Choose an instrument, and if you can play it, you can be in the school band." Brian wondered and looked around the room, before picking up a Hawk's silver tuba. He picked it up, blew into it, and to his amazement, it made a low rumble. "Wow, it's just like kissing," he thought to himself. And so, through a little white lie, he was now out of PE and in the school band. Sadly, the rest of Brian's schooling career wasn't so great. Here's an extract from his own biography from his now defunct website. "I fizzled out at school. For some reason, I was nearly top of the league for getting the slipper. I smoked 20 a day, paid for by doing a paper round and helping Harry, the local milkman. Upon leaving school, he worked a number of odd jobs until 1955, when he was called up for national service. Within the RAF, he then signed on as an administrative orderly, also known as a bandsman at the Royal Air Force Uxbridge on a 5-year contract. During this time, he was shipped off to Singapore during the Malayan emergency to play for and entertain all the troops stationed there. It was during this time that Herbie discovered arguably the two great loves of his life, jazz music and the double bass, which he first heard being played in clubs across Asia. This coincided perfectly with Herbie's desire to get his stripes for corporal, which would include a nice hefty pay rise, but meant he would need to master a second instrument, and so he bought a Hawk's double bass from his bandmaster Vic Hutchinson for £40. Herbie's first ever recording session came soon after and was for BBC Hong Kong in 1957, playing a selection of jazz standards on both the double bass and the tuba. an experience which no doubt served as a great starting point for his future illustrious career. It was also during this time that Herbie met and fell in love with the Colonel's daughter, Ann Sanderson, who would go on to play a pivotal role in his career. But more on that later. Herbie credits these years in the military as the secret to his excellent timekeeping on the double bass, often remarking that marching for long hours at 120 beats per minute contributed to his rock-solid sense of rhythm. New York City, of all places, was to be the scene of our future hitmaker's next musical revelation. As in late 1959 or early 1960, Flowers isn't quite sure of the exact year. Whilst on leave during his time as a bandsman on the RMS Queen Elizabeth, Herbie and the rest of the ship's musos liked to visit their local nightclubs to check out the local jazz scene. It was in one of these clubs that he saw someone playing what looked to be an electric guitar, except it was producing an exceptional low end. After the performance, he asked the musician exactly what it was he was playing, and the next day ended up at Manny's Music Store in New York, where he purchased his blue Fender jazz bass for the sum of $70. From that moment on, the holy trinity of Herbie's musical arsenal was now complete, and rather unusually for someone who's famous for being a pop and rock musician, he would never ever deviate from his trusty Hawks tuba, Hawks double bass, and 1960 Fender jazz bass. During his post-military career in the mid-1960s, Herbie was your average working musician, playing anything that paid, from the odd session all the way to performing in the orchestra pit of West Side Story in the West End. The timeline of events is somewhat murky regarding when Brian became Herbie, as is the exact reason for him doing so. Throughout his life, Herbie saw himself as a bit of a joker, a trickster, and a mischief maker, and often mused in interviews that no one named Brian Flowers would have ever made it in the music business, and that adopting the moniker of Herbie meant that producers would often book him because there would be no way someone with such a stupid name could be a bad musician. His big break came almost entirely by accident, when in 1967 he received a phone call from some guy named Paul McCartney who he didn't know, who explained to him that he needed a tuba and bass player for a session he was producing for his brother's comedy trio, The Scaffold. Herbie was somewhat bemused as to why Paul, the hottest bass player in the world at that time, wouldn't just play the bass on the track himself, with Paul explaining that he needed someone else to play the bass just so he could focus on being the producer of that session in the control room. The track, titled Thank You Very Much, reached number 4 in the charts, and the glowing endorsement given by Paul McCartney officially launched Herbie's career as perhaps the most in-demand session bassist in the UK. We are now entering the most busy and prolific period of Herbie's life, and frankly it would be impossible to give a good and definitive account of all the sessions he took part in. It is quite literally a case of you name the song and he played on it. Instead, I'm going to give you a few of my personal favourites alongside some lesser known hits that no doubt you'll be surprised feature Mr. Flowers. He played with 3 out of the 4 Beatles on their solo output, 4 Elton John albums, played on David Bowie's Space Oddity and Diamond Dogs album, as well as the accompanying tour. He played with Cat Stevens, Eartha Kitt, Roger Daltrey and even Tom Jones. It is estimated that he played on 20,000 sessions in his lifetime, with 500 chart-topping hit records in the 1970s. Earlier on, I mentioned that his wife at the time, Ann Sanderson, would be extremely important to his rise to the top of the session ladder. This was because she was in charge of all her husband's bookings, and quickly got a sense of which work to say yes to and which to turn down. Herbie often explained that he would get booked, but have no idea who the session was actually for. For a session on the electric bass, Herbie would turn up with this trusty Fender jazz bass with rotor-sound black nylon-wound true bass strings, and a little Wallace amplifier that he used for monitoring, often turning it off for the actual take to make sure there was no bleed on any given track. In one interview, Herbie explained his preference for his iconic double bass-like electric bass tone, saying, "I don't like effects on basses, I just like that raw sound, like James Jamerson and Paul Chambers. I've only ever used rotor-sound black nylon-wound true bass strings, and I like them because there's no squeak, and I'm no good at slapping." A true professional, Herbie could effortlessly switch between playing with his fingers or with a plectrum, suiting whatever the song or the producer required. Often during his heyday in the early 1970s, he would perform on multiple sessions across many different studios every single day, all for the standard session fee of £12 per recording. which is around £140 adjusted for inflation. The work ethic he had at the time was just unbelievable, driving to 3 different 3-hour-long sessions per day, at which they would often record 3 and 4 songs in that time, as well as set up, soundcheck, practice, record, and pack down before moving on to the next session. When asked in interviews as to why he was booked so often for so many sessions, he replied, "Players, especially those fantastic inventors of pop and rock records in those days, were coming up with phenomenal music day in, day out, year in, year out, and so were we. Some of the time, anyway. We were reliable, courteous, generally drink, drug, and BS free, cheap, a damn good laugh, first up and last to bed. You do the job, take the fee, and get your ass away. Studio work is expensive. The producer doesn't want you hanging around being in the way." No doubt though that the reason many of you clicked on this video is because of one bass line in particular, that we just have to talk about. I'm sick of people saying Walk on the Wild Side is a classic, you must be rolling in it. I got paid £12 and Bowie, who was voted Producer of the Year, didn't even show up until all the tracks were down. That's good production, isn't it? Phone up some clever people, stay out of the way, then collect the award. It was just a lucky thing. I got paid £12 for the session, end of story. Said a slightly irritated Herbie in a bass player interview about the creation of the song. There are so many fantastic accounts of how and why this bass line came to be, so I'll just give you a short and sweet version of how it was made. In 1972, Herbie was booked to play on Lou Reed's second solo album, Transformer. The whole album was done in just 3 days, according to Herbie, who took a particular liking to these sessions because the music had so much space in it, meaning that the self-professed old jazzer had much more room to improvise. When presented with the track eventually titled Walk on the Wild Side, which was just a few bars of C followed by a few bars of F, Herbie asked if he could go to his car and get out his double bass. After laying down a simple double bass guitar part, Herbie had this idea of dubbing over a part on the highest string on his electric bass 10 notes above the root note of each chord, essentially playing the major third of each chord in a higher octave, with some cool slides and fills added in. And so, after about 20 minutes, Herbie had unknowingly created the coolest bass line of all time. This bass line has been sampled numerous times by many artists, most famously on A Tribe Called Quest's breakout song 1990's Can I Kick It?, which inadvertently introduced Herbie's playing to a whole new generation of music lovers. When you're as hot a player as Herbie was in the 70s, naturally, after amassing so many hits, you'd want to have a go at making your very own album, which Herbie did with his 1975 studio album, Plant Life, which sold a meagre 299 copies on release, naturally ending Herbie's aspirations of an illustrious solo career. The closest he came to achieving a hit solo career was perhaps when he wrote the 1970s #1 single, Grandad, for Clive Dunn, which entirely came about after a chance encounter at a local chippy. Though primarily famous as a session man, he also found time to be in several bands throughout his life, starting off with Blue Mink in the late 1960s, scoring a few hits with them through the early 70s. He also had the honour of being in the final lineup of T-Rex from 1977 up until Mark Bolan's tragic death later that same year. But for prog rock fans like myself, Sky was the band that Herbie was born to play in. Now, I've done a full documentary about Sky, to which there will be a link to just above me and at the end of this video. But, to summarise briefly, Herbie Flowers was playing on a session for classical guitarist John Williams along with percussionist Tristan Fry, who enjoyed the session so much that they decided to form the ultimate 5-piece instrumental progressive rock classical fusion supergroup, along with keyboardist Francis Monkman and guitarist Kevin Peake. Each member then composed 2 songs and made a demo in order to try and find a record deal, a task which, considering the clout of each member, you'd think would be incredibly easy. But this was the height of punk rock in 1978, and no major label was interested in taking on what they viewed was a band of middle-aged men playing classical music, which in their heads no young people would be interested in. The band eventually signed to the small label Areola Records and christened themselves Sky, and released their debut album Sky 1 in 1979. To say the success of the band was somewhat surprising is something of an understatement, as Sky 1 reached number 2 in the UK album charts, and after several successful tours and TV appearances, Their follow-up album Sky 2 topped the charts and became the fastest-selling double album of all time in the UK. Despite various lineup changes, the band released 8 albums with the core lineup of Flowers, Fry and Peak remaining on each album, before disbanding after an RAF tribute concert in 1995. Herbie absolutely adored being in Sky, and the sheer fun of playing in that band is evident in all their music and live recordings, especially their performance at Westminster Abbey in 1981. When the venue started filling up with dry ice, the Dean of Westminster likened it to the Second Coming. Herbie loved the gig, but being the consummate professional he is, was not impressed by his bandmate Kevin Peake's improper attire for such a historic event, saying in an interview with Louder Sound about the occasion, "I was very disappointed that Kevin wore jeans. Not that I'm religious, but come on, not at Westminster Abbey." We're going to take a slight detour here on that note, and take a minute to appreciate the one-of-a-kind fashion sense of Herbie Flowers. The man certainly knew how to wear a woolly jumper, and it's certainly true that so many celebrities and influencers who rock them today are doing so exactly because of this iconic number Herbie wore in the video for Toccata. Hopefully this image isn't too spicy and gets the video demonetised. Backtracking now to Australia, 1980, where you could argue was the beginning of Herbie Flowers' most important contribution to the world of music. It was at a festival in Adelaide that Herbie Flowers gave his first ever rock shop. The rules of the Rockshops were simple, with the grand aim of helping children and young people become better composers, and giving them the rare chance to work with professional musicians to hone their craft before performing concerts for their parents and peers. Herbie said of young musicians, "I pity young people at home wondering how the hell to crack it in the music business. I wish I could do more for the young musician. You know, I wish a lot of the people who make a lot of money out of music would give some of it back, in the form of time and money, to set things up such as music colleges and facilities. We need more of those." Aside from helping young people, Herbie also used his rock shops to benefit some of the worst off in society, saying in one interview, "I started using rock music therapeutically when a woman who ran the prison visitors tea bar at Lewes Jail asked me if I could do a workshop with the inmates. It was wonderful. I wouldn't give money to charity, but I think that the Prison Reform Trust is great, and I'm happy to give my time to them." He also held similar workshops at jails across the country, recounting about one in Winchester Jail. "Half the blokes there have now written music and performed in front of their peers. I think it builds their self-respect and self-esteem. If nothing else, it gets a bunch of guys who are banged up for 22 hours a day out into a relaxed atmosphere where they know they're going to make music." Herbie also worked with children in psychiatric hospitals with severe mental health issues, helping them to compose music and form bands. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the majority of his working time was taken up by travelling around schools, colleges and community centres and venues delivering these wonderful rock shops, no doubt transforming the lives and musical aspirations of countless youngsters along the way. I mean, how many other people who've sold millions of records have ever done anything like this? How many people can say that they've genuinely given back to society in a way like that? He also lent his time and skills to many other community projects, including local choirs, as well as frequently gigging with friends in a variety of different bands and guises. Despite spending the majority of his working life in and around London, Herbie's heart was firmly embedded in the village of Ditchling, East Sussex, where he owned a gorgeous 17th century cottage. Having bought the place in 1984, this was Herbie's perfect place to spend the perfect day, beginning each morning sitting by his fish pond with a nice cup of coffee, feeding and watching the 200 plus inhabitants living in it. Herbie spent the last decade of his life doing what he loved best: performing, writing, recording and spending time with his friends, family and his beloved children and grandchildren. On September the 6th, 2024, in the early hours of the evening, prog rock and bass fans started reading news they desperately hoped wasn't true. Several people started sharing the caption, "RIP Herbie Flowers." A few hours later, the news was sadly confirmed by a family member that indeed the great Herbie Flowers had passed away on September the 5th at 86 years old. Tributes poured in from hundreds of his former colleagues, including Paul McCartney, David Essex, and even the estate of David Bowie, who wrote of Herbie's kindness and wonderful contribution to the music of Bowie and his associates over the years. But why isn't he a big star who is remembered in the same vein as the people who he worked for? Now, this is just my own personal opinion, but I feel like the old saying, "those who shout the loudest get heard," certainly applies in this scenario. Herbie was never one for bigging himself up, and I'm sure off the top of your head you can name hundreds of artists who are always vying for the spotlight and doing whatever it takes, engaging in whatever unruly behaviour is required to, and saying whatever is needed in order to keep their names fresh in the minds of the public, for better and for worse. Herbie wasn't like that though. He just turned up, he kept his head down, he played exactly what was needed, collected the cash, and politely moved on to the next session or the next gig. There were no wild drunken one-night stands, no televisions thrown out of bedroom windows, and no sensational drug busts as has come to be the unfortunate norm for many rock stars and pop musicians. There was only one man who, through his extraordinary talent and love of music, helped craft the greatest records of all time. What are some of your own personal favourite Herbie Flowers bass lines, and what records of his did you absolutely love and play to death when you were growing up? Or did you ever get to meet him or see him play live? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. I've been Ruby Jones. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with your friends, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. And if you're a fan of progressive music and different music, I really encourage you to check out my band, the Exotic Isis Project. There's a playlist here with all of our music and videos in. Specifically the song The Electrolyte Concerto in D major was inspired by Sky and the great music that Herbie Flowers created. Until next time, this is Ruby Jones signing off.